I thought it was going to be a peaceful weekend, home alone, just me and my dog. But that night, something felt off. It started with faint whispers, too quiet to ignore but too strange to explain. I shrugged it off, but then I found a note in the attic, a note written in a child's handwriting that said, "Help me." And that's when I realized I wasn't alone. Not anymore. What happens next will make you question whether you're truly alone at all. But before we get lost in the shadows, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out our chilling upcoming episodes. If you're enjoying our eerie stories, leave a like, drop a comment, and share the terror with others. And for even more eerie content, follow us on social media. Keep the fear alive. Thanks for joining me on this spooky journey. Now, let's dive into the nightmare. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. My parents had left for a quick getaway, leaving me behind to enjoy the house all to myself. I was an 18-year-old high school senior, used to being left alone in our quiet suburban home. The large, creaky house was old, built in the 1930s, and though I loved it for its character, there was something unnerving about its vast, empty spaces when the lights went out and the wind howled. The first night was calm. I spent the evening binging on my favorite shows and playing video games. Max, my black lab, kept me company, lying at my feet while I sat on the couch. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed, leaving the lights downstairs dimmed as usual. The silence of the house felt comforting at first, but as I passed the staircase, I suddenly had the eerie sensation that I wasn't alone. I shook it off, assuming it was just the house settling. As I lay in bed, the sounds of the night, distant wind, the occasional creak from the floorboards below became the soundtrack to my uneasy thoughts. I hadn't been asleep for long when I heard it. A soft whisper. It was so faint, I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again. A voice just out of reach, barely audible through the thick walls of my room. I sat up, heart racing. Max was lying at the foot of my bed, but he didn't seem to notice anything unusual. I strained my ears, waiting for the next sound. Nothing. I lay back down, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then the whispers came again. Closer this time, louder and more distinct. "Help!" Me? I froze, my pulse quickening. That wasn't just a noise. It sounded like words. Someone in need of help. I had no idea what it could be. Was someone trying to prank me? Was there a radio playing somewhere that I had missed? My mind raced through possibilities. I grabbed my phone and texted my parents, asking if they had left the attic lights on. There was a faint, warm glow coming from the corner of the house, and I hadn't remembered leaving it on. They didn't respond. In fact, my phone screen flashed with a strange error before it went completely black. My heart pounded. I made my way upstairs, Max trailing behind me. The house felt unusually cold as I climbed the stairs to the second floor. The attic door, which was normally just a plain wooden panel at the end of the hall, now seemed oddly inviting. The whispers had stopped, but the eerie silence was worse. I reached the attic door and hesitated. It was old, with a rusty handle that seemed reluctant to turn. Taking a deep breath, I twisted the knob. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I stepped inside, Max staying close, his hackles raised. There was no light, just the faint outline of old boxes and furniture covered in dust. "Is anyone here?" I called out, though I wasn't sure what I expected. There was no answer, no movement in the shadows. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A piece of paper pinned to the far wall, yellowed and frayed with age. It was a small note written in a child's handwriting, and it sent a chill down my spine as I read it aloud to myself. "Help me, I'm sorry. I won't tell anyone." Suddenly, I heard something, a soft shuffle from the far corner of the attic. I swung the flashlight toward the noise, but the beam didn't catch anything, just empty space. Max barked, his tail tucked between his legs. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt like something wasn't right. The house, which had always felt like a haven, now felt like a prison. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I backed away from the attic, my eyes never leaving the darkness. As I turned to leave, the whispers returned, louder this time. The words seemed clearer. "You shouldn't have come up here." I rushed out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. My phone had come back to life, so I tried calling my parents again, but the call wouldn't go through. I was completely alone, with nothing but the echoes of that voice haunting me. Max refused to leave my side as I paced around the living room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear. I slept fitfully, with one eye on the dark corners of the room and the other on the clock, counting down the hours until morning. I didn't sleep again. When my parents returned, they found me sitting on the couch, wide-eyed and shaken. I tried to tell them everything, the whispers, the note, the eerie feeling of being watched, but they didn't seem to understand. The attic, they said, was just full of old junk, nothing of consequence. They assured me I was just overtired, perhaps imagining things. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew that something had changed in that house. I moved out shortly after, leaving that haunting place behind. But every now and then when I'm alone at night, I still hear it, the soft whispering in the back of my mind, a reminder that some things should never be uncovered. I had always hated the old mirror in the hallway. It wasn't anything special, just a simple antique that had been passed down from my grandmother. It was large, framed in dark wood with intricate carvings, and it hung on the wall facing the staircase. But something about it always gave me the creeps. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, and it was just me and my little brother Luke in the house. He was only 10, so he was more excited about the prospect of staying up late and watching movies than about the fact that we were alone. I, on the other hand, had never been too comfortable in the house when it was just me. It wasn't that I was scared of the dark or anything childish like that. It was the atmosphere. There was an unsettling quiet in the house when no one else was around. That Friday night, Luke fell asleep early. He had a long week at school and was out cold before midnight. I stayed up in the living room, scrolling through my phone and watching some old reruns on TV. The house creaked in the usual places, but nothing out of the ordinary. That was until I heard it. The distinct sound of footsteps from upstairs. At first I thought it was Luke getting up to grab a snack or something, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. I immediately stood up, feeling that familiar knot of anxiety form in my stomach. I called Luke's name softly, but there was no response. I crept toward the staircase and called out again, louder this time. "Luke?" Still nothing. But the footsteps continued, slow and steady, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the upstairs hallway. My heart began to race. Luke was in bed, and my parents were miles away. Who else could it be? I hesitated, but then the footsteps stopped. That sudden silence made my breath catch in my throat. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the distinct sound of a door creaking open, followed by a soft thud, as if something heavy had been moved. It was coming from the direction of the hallway mirror. I didn't want to go up there. I didn't want to see what was making that noise. But the silence was unbearable. Grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen, I slowly made my way up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. Every step felt like it took a lifetime, the creak of the wooden stairs making the house feel even older than it was. As I reached the top, I turned the corner, my flashlight beam catching the edge of the hallway mirror. And that's when I saw it. There in the reflection, I saw a figure. It was a tall, shadowy shape, standing just outside the range of the flashlight's beam. I could see its outline clearly, as if it were blocking out the dim light from the hallway. My pulse skipped a beat, and I spun around to see if anyone was really there. But there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, no figure in sight. I turned back to the mirror, and the shadow was gone. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it my imagination? The reflection of the hallway playing tricks on me? Or had I really seen something? Someone? I backed away slowly, my mind screaming at me to leave the area, to get away from the mirror, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. As I turned to leave, I noticed something else. The reflection didn't match the reality. There, in the mirror, the hallway stretched on longer than it should have. It was as if the mirror had taken on a life of its own, showing an endless corridor beyond the normal walls of the house. And at the far end of that hallway, I could see another figure, this one even darker than the first, standing completely still, watching me. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. This time, much closer. I whipped around to see the hallway behind me, but there was no one there. I didn't know what to do. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to face the mirror once more. The figure in the reflection had moved closer, inching toward me. I could see its face now, a pale, hollow expression staring back at me with empty eyes. Its lips barely moved, but I could hear it, clear as day. "Don't leave." The voice came from the mirror itself. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, stumbling backward into the wall. I was frozen, caught between the real world and whatever nightmare the mirror was pulling me into. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel that presence. I could still hear the faint whispers from the reflection. I didn't take my eyes off the mirror as I turned and ran down the stairs. My body was trembling with fear, but I couldn't stop myself. I bolted out of the house and into the yard, not stopping until I was far enough away to feel like I could breathe again. I didn't even stop to grab my phone. All I could think of was getting out of that house. The next morning I went back inside, but the mirror was no longer in the hallway. It was gone. There was no trace of it, no sign of its presence at all. It was like it had never been there. My parents came home that afternoon and I told them everything that had happened, but they didn't believe me. They told me I had probably imagined it. But I know what I saw. I know the mirror in that hallway was more than just a reflection. It was something else. And it's been weeks since that night, but I still hear the whispers sometimes. I still hear that voice telling me not to leave. It wasn't the first time I'd been home alone, but that weekend felt different. My parents had gone out of town for a few days, and I had the entire house to myself. I had planned on spending it in peace, catching up on schoolwork, maybe watching some movies, just enjoying the silence. Our house was small but cozy, located at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing strange ever happened. I loved it here, but that weekend, I began to realize how easily something can shift in a place you think you know inside and out. It started on the first night. After a quiet dinner and a few hours of studying, I went to bed, ready for an early start the next day. As soon as I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I heard it. A faint, scratching sound coming from the walls. I sat up, trying to shake the sleepiness from my head. It wasn't loud, just subtle, like something small moving behind the drywall. My first thought was that it was probably some sort of rodent. We'd had an issue with mice a few months ago, but we'd taken care of it. It wasn't uncommon for houses this old to have little creaks and groans at night. But then the scratching stopped, and a voice followed. It was barely a whisper, almost imperceptible. At first I thought it was the wind, but no. There it was again, faint and urgent. "Help!" I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The house was still. The air was thick with silence. I strained my ears, listening. It came again, this time louder, but muffled, as if it were coming from within the walls themselves. "Help me!" I scrambled out of bed, my mind racing. I couldn't just ignore it. What if someone was in the house? What if someone had gotten in without me noticing? My mind played out every worst-case scenario, even though I knew logically it didn't make sense. I was alone. I had locked every door and window before bed. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and started looking around. I checked the windows and doors again, all secure. The voice had stopped, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the house settling. But now there was something else, something more unsettling. A subtle vibration in the walls. I could feel it in the floor, like something was moving, shifting. It wasn't like an earthquake or a house settling. It was rhythmic, steady, almost purposeful. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wind or some random noise, but then I heard it again, louder this time. "Help me!" I rushed to the living room, hoping to distract myself by watching TV. I turned on the set, volume cranked up, but the vibrating noise in the walls never stopped. The scratching, the whispers, they didn't go away. And now it seemed like it was moving closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox in the basement, convinced I was dealing with some sort of intruder, maybe someone hiding behind the walls of the house. I would find them. I started tapping lightly on the wall in the living room, just beneath the window. There was a hollow sound behind the drywall, and I felt a strange unease wash over me, as if something was watching me from the other side. Then the tapping stopped. I stared at the spot on the wall where I had been tapping, waiting for a response. But the seconds dragged by. The air felt colder. The humming in the walls seemed to grow louder, pressing against my eardrums as if something was trying to get out. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. On the other side of the wall, I felt like I was being drawn into it, like the walls themselves were pulling me closer. I took a deep breath and struck the wall with the hammer. A crack appeared. I struck again, and again, until finally the hole was big enough for me to peer inside. But there was nothing. Just darkness. I felt the cold air from behind the wall, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It didn't feel right. Whatever was behind that wall was not natural. I almost turned to leave. But then, out of the darkness, something caught my eye. A faint shimmer of light. Just a sliver, barely noticeable. I leaned forward, heart hammering in my chest, and saw it. a small object wedged between the studs in the wall. I reached in, my fingers trembling, and pulled it out. It was an old, cracked mirror. Its surface was smeared with dirt and dust, but there was something unsettling about it. Something in the reflection that didn't belong. I stared at the reflection for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. At first, I thought it was my own face, staring back at me, but then as I studied it, I saw something else. Behind my reflection, in the dim light of the flashlight, there was another figure, a pale, shadowy outline standing just beyond the glass. It wasn't my reflection, it was someone else. I blinked, and the figure was gone, but the whispers returned, louder now, more urgent. "Let me out." My mind raced. I dropped the mirror and stumbled back, the house suddenly feeling like it was closing in on me. The vibrations in the walls were gone, but the air was thick with something I couldn't explain. I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I was in my car. I sat there, in the driveway, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. The mirror, the whispers, the movement in the walls, none of it made sense. My phone was dead by that point, so I couldn't even call anyone for help. I just sat there, frozen in place, unable to move. When my parents came home the next day, I told them everything. They listened patiently, but didn't believe me. They said I was probably just stressed out, that I had imagined the whole thing. But I know what I heard, I know what I felt. The house is silent now, but every night I still hear it, the whispering, the scratching, as though something is still trying to break free from the walls. I had always been familiar with every inch of the house. My family moved into it when I was just a kid, and now, after high school, it felt like second nature to walk through each room. My parents were out of town for a weekend getaway, leaving me alone for a couple of days. I was excited. Finally, a few days to myself to relax, catch up on homework, and indulge in my own space. The house wasn't huge, but it had its quirks. A lot of character, my parents always said. Old wood floors that creaked when you walked across them, drafty windows that never quite sealed, and a small attic that never seemed to hold much other than old forgotten boxes. There was also a small door in the basement that I had never really paid much attention to. It wasn't locked or anything, but it had always been an afterthought, tucked away behind some clutter. I'd been down there 100 times before to grab tools, look for old holiday decorations, or search for something we'd misplaced, but I never thought to open that door. That small, nondescript door was just there, and I had no reason to wonder what was behind it. That Saturday afternoon, with my parents still hours away, I found myself wandering aimlessly around the house. I had cleaned the kitchen, caught up on schoolwork, and was now just trying to pass the time. My eyes kept drifting toward the basement door. It had been calling me in a way I hadn't noticed before. I know it sounds strange, but something about the door had always unsettled me, though I could never explain why. It was like it was hidden in plain sight, as though it didn't want to be seen. The more I thought about it, the more curious I became. Maybe there was something behind it. A room we'd forgotten about. A hidden closet, a crawl space, or who knows what else. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way down into the basement. The air was musty, and the low hum of the fridge was the only sound accompanying me as I approached the door. I had never felt scared of the basement before. It was always cold and dim, but it was a familiar place. I took a deep breath and turned the doorknob. The door opened with a quiet groan, and I stepped inside. The room was dark and small, barely lit by the dim light filtering through the basement windows. I swung the flashlight in a circle, revealing nothing but dust-covered shelves, old boxes, and more clutter. But as I scanned the room, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks, a large, faded rug in the center of the floor, partially rolled up at the edges like it had been shoved there hurriedly. The odd thing? I had never seen this rug before. I moved closer, and as I tugged the rug aside, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Beneath it was a trapdoor, exactly the kind of thing you see in horror movies, the kind that's never meant to be opened. But it was right there, under my feet, old and worn, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I hesitated. For a moment, I considered leaving the door alone, chalking it up to my imagination. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the latch and pulled it open, the wood creaking with the effort. The smell of damp earth and something decayed hit me like a wave. I shined my flashlight down into the darkness below, and what I saw made my heart race. A ladder descended into an inky black pit, far deeper than the basement floor. I could barely make out the bottom, but what caught my attention wasn't the dark abyss. It was the faint outline of something on the floor below. Something I couldn't quite identify. I don't know why I climbed down, but I did. My hands gripped the cold wooden rungs of the ladder, my heart hammering in my chest as I descended further into the unknown. Each step felt like it took forever. And the farther I went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if I were descending into some hidden, forgotten place that had been sealed off for a reason. Finally, my feet hit the ground. I clicked on the flashlight, and what I saw sent a rush of adrenaline through my veins. The room was tiny, barely enough to stand in. And on the floor in front of me, surrounded by old, rusted tools and broken furniture, was a large wooden chest. The chest was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was antique, covered in grime, but intricately carved with strange symbols I couldn't understand. My curiosity piqued even more. What was this? Why was it down here, locked away in this forgotten room? I crouched down, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I tried to open the chest. The lock was old and stiff, but I managed to force it open. The lid creaked as I lifted it, revealing what was inside. It was a collection of old photographs, dozens of them, stacked haphazardly on top of each other. I thumbed through the first few, and they looked like family photos. Black and white, faded with age. They were of people I didn't recognize, standing in front of houses I'd never seen before. But then, as I reached the bottom of the stack, something strange happened. The last few photos weren't old at all, they were recent. I recognized the house immediately. My house. But what made my stomach turn was the people in the photos. It was my family, standing in front of the house. But these photos were taken at different angles, through the windows, as if someone were standing outside watching them. And they were all taken in the last few months. Some had been taken when my parents were away. Some were taken while I was home alone. But what was the most terrifying part was the last photo. It showed me sitting in the basement, holding the flashlight. I froze, my blood running cold. I looked up from the photo to the dim shadows around me. Something shifted in the corner of the room and my eyes snapped to it. For a brief moment I thought I saw movement, a figure just standing in the shadows. But when I turned my flashlight toward it, the room was empty. Still, I scrambled up the ladder and slammed the trapdoor shut, not caring how loud I was. I ran upstairs, heart pounding, unable to breathe properly. I looked around the basement door, trying to make sense of it all, but there was no way to explain what I had just found. I locked the door behind me, threw the rug back over it, and vowed to never go near that trapdoor again. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it all, until I noticed something chilling. The rug wasn't in place anymore. It had been moved, and I knew deep down I hadn't touched it. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me, my house, and a much-needed break from work. My partner was away visiting family, and I had the whole weekend to myself. I always found comfort in solitude. I could enjoy the peace and quiet, relax without anyone bothering me, and recharge my batteries. At least, that was how it was supposed to be. My house is small but cozy, with a mix of modern touches and old charm. It's nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom cottage on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and fields. Nothing to make it stand out from any other house in the neighborhood. It was perfect for me, peaceful, private, and safe. But something was wrong from the moment I walked in that Friday evening. It started when I entered the living room. As I hung up my jacket and dropped my bag by the door, I glanced toward the mirror hanging above the fireplace. The reflection I saw startled me, just for a moment. It wasn't anything drastic, but the way the light hit the glass made the room behind me look distorted, like the angles were off. I brushed it off as tired eyes and a shift in perspective. But as the weekend went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly different in the house. It was as though it wasn't just the atmosphere that had changed, but something deeper, something lurking in the corners. I ignored the creeping sense of unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I was alone after all. There was no reason to be afraid. Saturday night, after dinner, I decided to watch some TV. The house was dark except for the glow of the television, and the occasional gust of wind made the trees outside sway ominously. I'd grown used to the creaks of the house. Old houses always make noises, but there was something about that night that felt different. I'd been lounging on the couch for a while when I glanced toward the hallway mirror once again. This time, the reflection caught me off guard. It was subtle, but I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the doorway behind me, just out of view of the reflection. I spun around quickly, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought as my mind playing tricks. It was late, and I was tired. I had a habit of overthinking things, especially when I was alone for too long. I got up to grab a drink from the kitchen and passed by the mirror on my way. My reflection looked normal, but the second I glanced away, I caught a glimpse of something strange. My reflection wasn't matching my movements perfectly. It was like I was slightly ahead of myself. I froze. That's when I felt it. The unmistakable sense of being watched. I turned slowly back toward the mirror, trying to steady my breath, but the reflection had changed again. The version of me in the mirror was smiling, just barely, but enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. It wasn't my smile. I hadn't even smiled. My reflection wasn't reacting the way I was. It was as though something, was mimicking me. I backed away from the mirror, heart pounding, but the strange reflection didn't disappear. It stayed, staring back at me with that unnerving, unnatural smile. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me screamed to leave the room. I felt drawn to it, like I had no control over my own body. The reflection began to move on its own, not exactly mirroring me anymore. It tilted its head slightly, still grinning, and then it winked. That was when I bolted. I ran from the living room, not daring to look back. I locked myself in my bedroom and pulled the covers over my head, trying to calm my breathing. The house was silent, save for the occasional gust of wind rustling the trees outside. I didn't dare leave the room for hours. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing small noises, creaks and cracks, like something, or someone, was moving around the house. I kept thinking I could hear faint whispers from the hallway, but when I'd listened closely, there was nothing. When I woke up the next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just an overactive imagination. The night had been too long, the silence too oppressive, and I was alone for the first time in a while. I got out of bed, tried to shake off the lingering dread, and made some coffee. But as I walked past the hallway mirror, I froze. There, in the reflection, was my own face. But it wasn't me. The person staring back at me wasn't my face, at least not entirely. My eyes were empty, devoid of any expression, and the corners of my mouth were twisted into that same unsettling grin. It wasn't a normal smile. It was wide, unnatural, almost as if it were mocking me. I stepped closer to the mirror, feeling my stomach churn. I reached out a hand, and as my reflection mimicked the movement, I felt a sudden jolt of panic. My reflection didn't follow my movements like it had before. Instead, it stayed frozen in that strange, distorted grin. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest object, a picture frame, and smashed it against the mirror. The glass cracked with a loud, shattering sound, but the reflection didn't disappear. What happened next was impossible to explain. The cracks in the mirror seemed to spread outward, but not in the way you'd expect. The shattered pieces didn't fall. Instead, they shifted. The pieces of glass were moving on their own, crawling across the mirror's frame like they had a life of their own. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking beneath me. I stumbled back into the living room and turned on every light in the house. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay there a second longer. I had to get out. Just as I was about to leave, I saw something in the reflection of the hallway mirror one last time. It wasn't me anymore, it was someone else. Someone who looked just like me, but with hollow eyes, a twisted grin, and a cruel expression that was so completely wrong. They were standing in the hallway watching me. I turned toward the doorway, but when I looked back at the mirror, the hallway was empty. I left the house immediately and didn't return until my partner came home. When I explained what had happened, they insisted that I was just tired or stressed, that it was all in my head. But I know what I saw, and I'm sure of one thing. Whatever it wasn't me. It had been a long week, and by Friday, I was looking forward to some peace and quiet. My roommate had gone to visit their family for the weekend, leaving me alone in our small apartment for the first time in ages. I relished the thought of having the whole space to myself. No loud music, no one in my way, just me and the silence. I had some work to catch up on, and maybe I would spend the evening binge-watching a series I had been meaning to start. I live in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the third floor of an old building that had seen better days. The creaky floors and peeling paint only added to its character, but I loved it. The building was in a quieter part of town, not far from the main road, but enough that I could always enjoy a little solitude. The first few hours of being home alone were exactly what I needed. I cooked a simple dinner and settled into the couch, trying to focus on work. As night fell, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in a while. But that calm didn't last long. Around midnight, after I had finished up the last of my work, I decided to go to bed. The apartment was still, the only sound being the hum of the refrigerator. I turned off the lights and crawled under the covers, ready for a restful night. That's when I noticed it. At first I thought it was nothing, just the usual creaks and groans of the old building settling. But then I heard it again. A faint thud, as if something had fallen, followed by the soft scrape of footsteps on the hardwood floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, trying to listen carefully. There were no other sounds in the apartment. My roommate wasn't supposed to be back until the following evening, and I was sure I had locked the door behind me when I came in. I chalked it up to my imagination and rolled over, trying to ignore the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. The sounds could easily be explained by the house's old structure. After all, the pipes and walls were known to make strange noises at night. But the sounds didn't stop. They grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, slow and measured, as though someone was pacing back and forth in the hallway just outside my bedroom door. My pulse quickened. I lay perfectly still, listening intently, convinced I was hearing things. The footsteps paused for a moment, and then just when I thought it was safe to breathe again, I heard a faint knocking. Knock, knock, knock. It came from the door, so quiet at first that I wasn't sure I had heard it. But then it came again, more insistent this time. Knock, knock, knock. I slowly got out of bed, my legs unsteady, and made my way to the door. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the doorknob. The knocking stopped, but the silence was worse. My mind raced. Should I open it? Should I call someone? I wasn't sure what I expected to find on the other side, but my gut told me to leave the door closed. I backed away and decided to call my roommate, hoping to hear their reassuring voice on the other end. My fingers trembled as I dialed the number. The phone rang, then went to voicemail. I left a quick message. "Hey, just checking in. Call me back when you get this." That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. I returned to my bedroom, feeling uneasy. I told myself it was just the noise of the old building. It was late, my mind was tired, and I was probably just overthinking things. But as I lay back down, trying to shake the discomfort, I heard it again. The footsteps, closer this time, coming from the hallway outside my door. It wasn't just random creaks, it was deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth, taking their time. And then that soft scraping noise, like nails running lightly over the floor. I grabbed my phone and dialed my roommate again. This time, I didn't wait for the voicemail. I called and called until the phone finally rang. "Hello?" My roommate's voice cracked through the speaker, sounding confused and a little groggy. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice betraying my anxiety. "I'm at my mum's house. What's up?" I felt my stomach drop. You're sure you're not here? You're not messing with me?" I asked, the words tumbling out faster than I could think. "Of course I'm not there. You know I'm not coming back until tomorrow. Are you okay?" I swallowed hard, trying to gather myself. "Yeah, I just heard something. I think there's someone in the apartment with me. There are footsteps and knocking on the door." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure? Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks," my roommate said. "You're alone for the first time in a while, right? Maybe you're just spooked." But I didn't feel spooked, I felt watched. I stayed on the phone with them for a few more minutes, trying to calm myself down, but the footsteps never stopped. The pacing continued, slowly moving from the hallway to the living room and back again. It was as if whatever it was trying to get my attention. "Just stay in your room, okay?" my roommate said. "I'll be home tomorrow. If it gets worse, call the cops. But I'm sure you're just overthinking it." I hung up and went to the living room, feeling a surge of adrenaline. My phone was still in hand, and I was prepared to call the police if needed, but as I passed through the hallway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the small closet in the hallway was slightly ajar. I never left it open. It had always been closed ever since I moved in. I stepped forward cautiously, holding my breath, and gently pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, and for a moment I thought I saw something dark, just a shadow, move in the corner of the closet. But when I turned on the light, the closet was empty. Still, that feeling lingered. I wasn't alone in the apartment. I couldn't explain why, but I knew deep down that something or someone was there with me. I spent the rest of the night locked in my room, lights on, door bolted. The footsteps continued, faint, almost inaudible, but I could hear them. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't until the next morning when my roommate returned that I felt safe enough to leave the room. But as I walked through the apartment, I noticed something else. The door to the closet, it was closed again, completely shut. And then I saw it. A single, small, muddy footprint on the floor just inside the threshold. I still don't know who or what was in my apartment that night, but I do know this, that shadow, that feeling of being watched, it's never gone away, and I don't think I'll ever be truly alone in that apartment again. It was a quiet evening, one of those peaceful, chilly autumn nights where the world outside seems to slow down and everything feels just a little bit softer. I was home alone in the small 2-story house I had rented for the last 6 months. My roommate was away visiting family for the weekend, leaving me with nothing but time and the comfort of solitude. The house wasn't anything extravagant, but it suited me perfectly. It had character, the creaky floors, the old windows that rattled when the wind picked up, and the heavy oak door that always seemed to groan when it was opened. The neighborhood was quiet too, mostly families, a few elderly residents, and a couple of young couples who were just starting out. It was the kind of neighborhood where you barely ever hear anything at night. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was just one thing that had always unsettled me: my neighbor, Mr. Knox. Mr. Knox was an elderly man who lived in the house next to mine, an old Victorian-style building that had clearly seen better days. The house was always in a state of disrepair, its shutters hanging off crookedly, and the garden overgrown with weeds. Mr. Knox wasn't a very social person. He kept to himself and rarely left his house. But on the occasions when we did cross paths, he would stare at me with a strange intensity, like he was studying me. I'd always gotten the feeling that something was off about him, but I never paid much attention to it. He was just odd, right? That night, I had no plans other than to relax and unwind. I ordered takeout, caught up on some shows, and after a while, I settled in to read a book. The only sound in the house was the occasional rustling of the pages turning and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I don't know what time it was when I first heard it, but I was in the middle of a chapter when I was pulled out of my thoughts by a strange sound. It was a faint tapping, almost like a soft knock. It came from the direction of the wall shared with Mr. Knox's house, just behind the living room. At first, I assumed it was some odd noise from the house settling, perhaps the wind shaking the walls or a pipe creaking in the old structure. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. It wasn't loud, but it was rhythmic, steady, like someone was tapping on the wall. I glanced nervously at the clock. 2 a.m. It was far too late for anyone to be working on the house, and Mr. Knox hadn't been outside all day. In fact, I hadn't seen him at all that week. The old man was a creature of habit, and if he were out there, I would have noticed by now. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound came again, this time louder. It was like a deliberate knock. Slow, deliberate. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as though someone on the other side of the wall was trying to get my attention. I stood there for a few moments, trying to decide whether to investigate or just ignore it. I tried calling my roommate, but the phone went straight to voicemail. I considered calling a friend, but my mind told me that would only make me sound paranoid. It was probably nothing, right? But then, something made me walk toward the wall. I approached cautiously, feeling a strange pull to it. As I neared the wall, the tapping stopped. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard something else, a soft, scraping noise like fingernails dragging across the surface of the wall. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. My stomach turned, and I quickly stepped back. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it a prank? Was Mr. Knox playing some twisted joke on me? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Mr. Knox was old, frail. He couldn't have been out there tapping on the wall at this hour, right? Then the silence broke again. But this time, it wasn't a tap. It was a voice. A low, raspy whisper coming from the wall. "Let me in." My blood went cold. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. I thought I must be hearing things. Surely that wasn't real. But the whisper came again. "Let me in." It was unmistakable. The voice was hoarse, almost like it had been strained, as if someone had been calling out for help for far too long. But the most unsettling thing was how familiar it sounded. It was as if it were Mr. Knox's voice. But that was impossible, right? I backed away from the wall, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. I felt a wave of panic rise in me. My head was spinning, my instincts screaming at me to get out of the house, to run far, far away. But I couldn't bring myself to move. I was rooted in place, paralyzed by the feeling that something was very wrong. Then, as if on cue, the voice stopped. Silence descended on the house again. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to gather my thoughts. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the walls had just made some strange sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was on the other side of that wall, watching me, waiting. I grabbed my phone again, this time dialing Mr. Knox's number. It rang several times before going to voicemail, and I felt an uneasy knot form in my stomach. Why wasn't he answering? I had never called him before, but I figured I might as well. I left a quick message. "Mr. Knox, if you're there, I'm hearing strange noises from the wall between our houses. Just wanted to check in." For a long time, I didn't hear anything from him. I kept staring at my phone, willing it to ring. But then, as I sat back down on the couch, something strange happened. The lights flickered. For a split second, the power seemed to cut out and everything went dark. I scrambled to find my phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness. Then I heard it. The soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps shuffling on the other side of the wall. I didn't waste a second. My legs carried me quickly to the front door, my mind a blur of fear and uncertainty. I flung the door open, the cool night air rushing in as I stepped outside. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked toward Mr. Knox's house. It was dark, no lights on in the windows. But something in the yard caught my eye. The garden, what little was left of it, was now meticulously arranged, neatly trimmed. The leaves and branches formed an almost deliberate pattern, as though someone had taken great care in arranging them. And in the middle of the yard, staring at me from the shadows, was Mr. Knox. His eyes were wide, almost feverish, and he was standing perfectly still, his frail body bent slightly forward. He didn't move. He just watched. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that strange, silent stare, but I couldn't take it any longer. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I didn't feel safe anymore. The tapping, the voice, it had stopped. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Knox wasn't just an odd neighbor. There was something darker about him, something unsettling that I couldn't understand. The next morning, when I finally worked up the courage to check, I found that Mr. Knox was gone. His house was empty and the front door stood ajar as if he had left in a hurry. But the strangest part, the patterns in his garden were gone, as though they had never been there at all. I've never felt the same walking around that neighborhood. I never saw Mr. Knox again, but sometimes, when the wind picks up and the night is still, I still hear the faintest sound of tapping on the wall, and it always makes me wonder, was he ever really gone? Have you ever faced something truly terrifying? Eerie Shadows wants to hear your story. Share your chilling experiences with us on Reddit, and together we'll uncover the eerie mysteries lurking in the shadows. If you'd like to support the channel and help us create even more terrifying content, consider checking out our Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support helps us keep the horror alive. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more bone-chilling tales like this one. Stay tuned for the next eerie episode